construe the scope of what we've agreed to internationally. So concretely, though, every 5 years, Canada has to report on how we're doing. And repeatedly, I've been to these sessions, typically in Geneva, where we get to say, actually, things are getting worse in Canada when it comes to the right to food. And the government usually just kind of shrugs its shoulders and says, these are complicated issues. And what we typically tell the committee members is, we're relying exclusively on government data. This is their own data, which shows things are going to get. So I know that doesn't kind of explain all the nuances and complexities of international human rights law, but for these purposes, it might be enough.
Just a question there.
Yeah.
The data that Canada uses to report back, that's coming from StatsCan, or
typically StatsCan. It could be typically government reports, both federal and provincial.
Okay.
They're government reports, and that's not too surprising. You would expect government representatives to do that, and so we, as the authoritative man, so the reliability of data. So it's almost a sacred trust that we only rely on government stats because we want to avoid any complaints that our stuff isn't reliable or whatever. We say, well, look, here's the government's own data showing this, and that. Those are typically sources that are beyond this group.
So, simple question: can we actually make food as a human right in Canada right now?
Okay. Can't give a simple answer.
Of course, you're a lawyer.
I would say, so you've heard about how we use international human rights domestically through litigation, and I mentioned interpreting, what certain terms meant, and how certain schemes, legislative schemes, particularly social assistance schemes, the ambiguities in them get interpreted using international human rights law. The other question, and what is it, 30 years, 35 years since the Charter of Rights came in, that we still don't know the answer to, is whether the Canadian Constitution protects the right to food. And so many charter cases have been litigated, typically by companies or governments, whatever. But the voice of low-income people, people who experience food insecurity, is only Canada. So there are 2 or 3 constitutional provisions that are super relevant. One is Section 7 of the Charter of Rights, which in a nutshell says everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Life, liberty, security of the person. What does that mean? Well, that's where lawyers come in. And it can be included and interpreted as including the right to food. And in South America and in Germany, these rights are interpreted in a way that could be a right to food. What has the Supreme Court of Canada said about that? They said, that's a hard one. Let's decide another time. That was a case where they said that was a case from 2002. And so what have they said in the 18 years since?
Nothing.
At all. There's another provision, Section 15, right to equality. Some would say, well, that means in order to enjoy equality, you've got to have food security. Get to the second question.
We'll get the question after your balance.
So the right to equality might also be interpreted together with you. Lastly, there's a provision called Section 36 of the Constitution Act, which I'm sure 99.9% of law profs have never heard of, and certainly the public and lawyers in general. It's a provision that commits the federal and provincial governments to several things, including the provision of essential public services of reasonable quality to all Canadians. Does that include the right to food? Sure should. You would think so. That Sylvain here is my main authority. And what has the Supreme Court said about that? Nothing. But they would say it hasn't come up. Well, there's a reason it hasn't come up, because the Supreme Court of Canada controls which cases it hears, and almost never do they hear from low-income people about the cases that are of interest.
They can't afford to get that.
That's one issue.
Yeah. Thank you, Vince. Before we move on to Jamie, I see people in the back standing. Sorry, we have no chairs left. If there are chairs outside,
Couple scattered around.
is there any? Oh, there's a couple here.
There's one here as well.
And there's more people coming in. Hey, welcome. So there's actually, I see 3 empty chairs here, if you don't mind coming in. And I also want to remind people this is being live streamed. It's online, right? And we'll probably be able to accept questions from people online if you're listening, if you're out there in the middle of the snowstorm. All right.
Sure, I add a few things about my own area, or do you want to come?
If you don't mind, we'll just move on. If you don't mind, Vince. You can look up Vince on the internet. He's right downtown, right here. Moving on to Jamie Baxter. Jamie is obviously an academic from Dalhousie from the Sylvain School of Law, but he has also done some work in the area with the city, I believe, and you were involved with different projects on food security. So, Jamie, your take on the question.
Thanks, Sylvain, and thanks, Vince. That was, I think, an excellent introduction. And I'm not a human rights expert, and so I'll just kind of speak to what it is that I most know about, which is the kind of relationship between food governance and local government, which is what I study mostly these days. And I sit as a member of the Halifax Food Policy Alliance, which is a stakeholder group that works, a multi-stakeholder group that works on food policy for the city. And I'll speak a little bit about that as I just make a few points about what this idea of a human right to food might mean for local government. And there's really just a few points that I want to make about the role of local government. And you'll notice that in Vince's very accurate kind of phrase relationship to human rights law. And so I'm interested in the kind of opportunities and challenges that a right to food presents for local governance over our food systems. And the kind of main point here is that increasingly we see municipal governments, cities for sure, but also other forms of local government in rural areas and so forth, getting involved in governing the food system through various powers that they have, like land use planning, or their carriage over. Local governments have a very close association to various key points of that food chain. And so governing food and trying to ensure better food insecurity, all the food policy. And here I'm thinking in particular about Toronto, which in the early 2000s, there's a specific reference to something that Vince mentioned, economic, social, and political rights. And so you saw at a particular point in time, let's move them forward. So that was true at a particular point in time where I think there was maybe a more close relationship between municipalities and thinking about their policy domains, international human rights law. But it's also interesting to me that in a more recent time, where you've seen several other cities in Canada in particular take up local food policies, there's less, I think, at least on my read, reference to, at least explicit reference to, certainly those international legal instruments. There are some more in those particular discussions. And that happens to be true of to a degree of Halifax as well. It doesn't mean that there isn't thinking and rep part of our kind of discourse around thinking about food. Now, you could ask the question, I think, as to why that is, and I don't have any good answer for all of you, but I'll just throw a few suggestions or ideas before we kind of move past me. I think one of that has to do very much with, in part, some of the details that Vince talked about, that human rights law isn't well geared towards municipalities. Although we've started to see that international human rights system in particular focus more on the role of local governments. And the other reason I think that if there's a challenge around rights of food is that increasingly what municipalities are doing is operating in a mode that we kind of talk about as collaborative governance. That is to say, rather than just the government regulating or enacting a bunch of local government bylaws around food, you see local government partnering with non-governmental organizations, with private sector actors, with other levels of government to kind of make policy and implement policy in a much more collaborative mode. And that kind of new mode of way that we govern food systems or think about governing food systems is a bit of a tricky one for the traditional human rights system to get a handle on. And the way that we think about rights is strictly holding kind of states to its obligations. Although I also think that there's certain positive movements and opportunities here in the way that, for example, the United Nations human rights bodies are starting to think about coming to terms with that. And I think the basic idea here is there's real opportunities when we think about this idea of progressive realization of, for example, a right to food. It seems to necessarily require all of these actors working together to do that. And so I think this idea about collaborative governance is probably a really positive one. And the other one that I'll also just mention kind of very briefly is, we talk sometimes about this idea of food sovereignty in kind of food policy world and food law. And that's not particularly well defined as a legal term, I think it's fair to say, but it does present something of what we might say an alternate vision to how certain actors in the food system want to think about kind of rights and obligations. It's very different from the kind of liberal state tradition of the state's obligations and the individual who has or holds those rights predominantly, although there's some room in social and political rights for communities or collective rights, certainly. And so, when we talk about food sovereignty, sometimes, for example, for First Nations who want to recognize or realize aspirations towards self-governance and so forth, a different kind of frame than the conventional human rights frame may seem more appropriate in certain circumstances. That's not to make those mutually exclusive by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that there are significant differences in the traditions behind those ideas and the way that we would come to think about them in law and so forth. So really just a few ideas that are situated in particular around local government, but as I say, my view is some real opportunities, some challenges for thinking about our right to food in the municipal context, but I'm by no means pessimistic, other than the basic pessimism about that. I think Vince might share about how well Canadian governments have performed to date in terms of deployment.
Thank you, Jamie. So I guess food sovereignty, you feel this argument has merit, depending on the context and the population that you look at.
I don't know that I have enough understanding of an implementation of food sovereignty in all contexts, and I think we could talk about particular cases to make a call whether or not it has merit. I certainly think it's an important and significantly alternative frame to thinking about this idea of kind of human rights and what it accomplishes when we talk about food, because it comes from these international peasants movements that are self-organized about local self-governance and about kind of localism that is and comes from a very different place in thinking about the kind of the big state, which is where human rights normally sits. And so, it's probably important for local government because local government is that level of government that is closest to the people. And so I think there's probably a real affinity between local food governance and this idea of right to sovereignty that kind of comes out of that particular context. So I certainly wouldn't want to be dismissive of it as an important tool to look at.
Perfect. Thank you, Jamie. And finally, Patty Williams from Mount St. Vincent University, director of the Food Action from a different perspective. How do you see this concept of making food as a human right, I guess?
Yeah. So what I'm going to talk about, and people at the back hear me so far, just wait if you can't, is how we've used the research at Food Art to look at the right to food, and we've done a fair bit of work with Vince in terms of trying to use our research to examine how we're doing with respect to the right to food and sort of make that argument. But I'm also going to share just a little bit around sort of how we work and how sort of some of the lenses that we bring to this maybe I guess different approaches to thinking about the right to food and whether to use that argument or not use that argument. So maybe before I start, just to hundreds, I think, of studies is an exaggeration, maybe approaching. But just to say also that the work that I'm talking about comes from probably hundreds, definitely hundreds of committed partners and organizations in this province as well as across the country that have contributed to the work. So it's definitely not my work. I'm kind of speaking to the research that is shared by a lot of the partners in this room. So, and these are the thing we're really committed to together, collectively addressing structural barriers to food insecurity. And this is where I think the right to food is a really important frame that we can use. The reason, I guess, that food, from a nutritional perspective, food really, it meets, we need it for our physiological needs, but it also bridges to our psychosocial needs. So it's one of these, I think it's unique in that aspect in terms of the central role that it plays in so many aspects of our life. Other things, other basic needs are essential, but there's something special about food that is a connector. We need it in terms of those sort of low levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of, it sits there with water as water, food, and sort of other sort of both indirectly and directly impacts those higher levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs around, self-esteem and just being able to realize the dream hopes and women generally. And so we know that women are more impacted by food insecurity, definitely gender and being a woman. increases your risk of experiencing food insecurity. And we know that you know, families that experience food insecurity in Nova Scotia, there's about, well, the latest national data that we have says that we have almost 18% of our population that is experiencing food insecurity. And I would say actually at least rather than almost, because we know that we're not measuring food insecurity in some of the more vulnerable populations like the homeless and others.
That 18% I've heard before, it's dramatic. What does it mean? Does it mean that a person basically experiences food insecurity all year round or for a period of time?
So the way that it's measured in Canada is important, and it's about compromised access to food, and it's also worrying about having to you know, run out of food or knowing when your next meal is going to come. So it's that both the sort of worry and the actual compromising either quantity or quality. And then depending on the severity of food insecurity in the family, it also impacts your, you know, social interaction, that whole, you as a whole person. And it just is debilitating is what some of the qualitative research has shown. You know, we've heard from mothers in the province ability to participate in their communities and, you know, even in terms of trying to protect their children and not really protecting the children because the children see it in their homes. So children are, you know, that the health consequences of food it increases your risk of chronic disease later in life. It increases your risk of depression and suicidal ideation. Even there's to show it's related to that. So in terms of mental health, huge impacts on families and, you know, children's ability to succeed in school and do well. And so then it, you know, that's where it has sort of implications in terms of the cycle of poverty, the cycle of food insecurity.
Yeah.
So we basically what our research has shown, and similar to some of the food pricing work that your lab has done, so that we looked at the cost of a basic nutritious food basket in Nova Scotia, and we worked with people who experience food insecurity to design that research and collect the data and interpret the research. So we've now done 7 cycles of food costing in the province, and the last time in 2015. And what our data shows is, you know, it just basically puts an end to any argument that people can simply make a healthy choice to choose a healthy diet. It's just for some households in this province, and you know, we're talking approaching 20% of households in this province. They don't have that choice.
Not even a choice.
It's not a choice. It's that simply don't have enough funds, and not only don't have enough funds, but they're actually, if they were, you know, that the world to purchase that basic nutritious diet, they would be experiencing hundreds of dollars debt, and close to, in some cases, it's, you know, $900 debt. You know, and we looked at some families recently with pregnancy and moms that are breastfeeding that are in, you know, lone mothers, and it's actually upwards of $1,000 a month if they were to purchase that basic nutritious diet, that extra nutrition that they would need for the special time of life.
So the last one was in 2015, you said?
Yeah, and so
I bet if you would have to do it this year, given what we've seen with prices, probably have gotten worse. It's probably getting worse.
And that's been the trend across these 7 cycles of food costing. We've essentially seen that in Nova Scotia, if you are on income assistance, that you are pretty well guaranteed to be food insecure. Like it's in Nova Scotia, it's almost 83% of people that are on income assistance that report experiencing food insecurity. And so for people on income assistance, what our data has shown is that the situation's gotten worse since we started doing this in 2002 to 2015, that we've seen a trend where the potential deficit that families would be facing has increased dramatically. And, you know, the Department of Community Services in the province has recently undergone transformation, but it really hasn't resulted in more money in the pockets of people. There's been increases. There's been, over the years since we've been doing this, there's been increases to the personal allowance portion of income assistance. But with the increasing costs of living that has accompanied it, it hasn't kept pace for sure. It's actually, we're seeing increasing levels. I guess maybe the other thing to say is just it's not only low-income families in the province, it's also in Nova Scotia, as in other places in Canada, we, I guess, our government's put priority on exporting food and not. So we know that the province from food produced locally is very low, and it's increasing slightly, but still now it's telling us that we need to also think we need to think in terms of a comprehensive long-term policy around food. And we do with the current, there's limits, but in terms of really putting sort of the meat on that framework, it hasn't happened yet, so we really have to be seen. But I think that's where the advocacy is really important, to really make, and use sort of the right to food. I think is a strong case that we can, to work with to really figure out how to use the language to make a case, to convince people that this is something that not only impacts individuals experiencing food insecurity and our farmers and our fishers, but it impacts everybody in society. You're not going to be not touched by this, because everybody's going to be impacted by climate change and sort of the way that we've been using our natural resources, food and water included within that. We've just, unprecedented rates of, in terms of erosion of lands that we can produce food on, and contamination of water, and also just the impact that climate change itself has on people living in food insecure environments and being able to produce food that is at risk. And so, and then on the other side, for people that are experiencing poverty, we're going to see increasing rates of that if we don't do something about climate change. And we're also, we know we've been seeing escalating healthcare costs. Valerie Traffic has some excellent data out of University of Toronto that shows that increasing rates of food insecurity, increasing levels of food insecurity is associated with increased cost to the health system. So, and it's, there's just building evidence of the healthcare costs associated with food insecurity. So I think that we need to start talking about food as it should be talked about, as a fundamental right, as something that it's not something we can do without. It's something that we, in order to have a healthy population, in order to have a planet into the future, we need to be ensuring our right to food.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Patty. I know some people actually approach me because they need to leave early, so don't be shy. It's not because our panelists insulted some of us. They just need to leave, so don't be shy if you need to leave. And the weather, of course, is a bit of a problem tonight. So, questions? Yes.
Since I have sorry to leave early, but Thomas Starkenberg, I'm a professor of science and also the leader of the Green Party. I'm not a native English speaker and also not a lawyer, so I just learned that treaties mean something saying nice, but never enforceable. So what are they for anyhow? But I'm wondering, it's about so are there other jurisdictions which have done something which had really an impact? So I know, for example, in Germany, there's the right of housing, and it is enforced by the municipalities. And this makes a big difference. It puts a lot of strain on the municipalities, but they have to deal with it, and we have probably to change from there. So I'm wondering if there are some examples where people have already done more, and maybe where we can learn from.
I mean, right here in Canada, we've actually had examples of where we've taken measures, although probably not completely adequate, but to protect the right to food by instituting, like, in terms of for seniors, we had very high poverty rates at one time, and now we have very low poverty rates and rates of food insecurity to accompany that in certain segments of the senior population, and that's because of the guaranteed income supplement. So something like a basic income, which has been
Could you explain a little bit what that is? Maybe some people don't know what that concept is.
So
the basic and guaranteed
So
income.
a basic guaranteed income is when you're ensuring so an adequate level that every citizen would have an adequate level of income to meet basic needs, and some would argue even to go beyond just to meet basic needs, but to be able to participate fully in society. And so there's different ways, and others can probably speak to this better than I can, but there's different ways that you can achieve a basic income. It is something that people from, across different political stripes have agreed upon. How we get there is something that people haven't necessarily agreed on, but
they were pilots in the country.
Yeah, and Ontario had committed before the last government committed to piloting a basic income, but that sort of went down the drain. I know that I think the food policy, the basic income, Nova Scotia, I think, has put forward the idea of a basic income to the HRM. So it's been considered at a municipal level. I don't know, Jamie, maybe speak to that.
And to the province.
The proposal was submitted to the province.
Yes.
Okay.
Chat with bureaucrats.
But Jamie, do you want to comment on that?
I can't comment on basic income. No. I could give another example though, just in response. You asked a little bit about, and this is right here, right? So there's a global movement called the Right to the City. So this is again, in municipal context. And Montreal is an example in Canada here that attempted to adopt an explicit framework about how to bring, and this is more general than the right to food, but about human rights into municipal policy, governments, and lawmaking. And they've adopted an explicit policy to say what we're going to do and govern is to try and do it through a kind of human rights framework. And it's part of, as I say, a kind of global movement toward that. And so there's an example of where you may see real results, particularly with respect to food, because it's much more explicit in local government framework than we see in really any other example.
Mm-hmm. So Vince, any comments?
No.
We're good. Next question, yes.
The cost of providing food security to individuals and even to families is reasonably small. Would be appropriate rather than thinking about the Supreme Court for a group to get some law students to go with some people who are food insecure to a small claims court and let a small claims person mediate it to start with.
People get the gist of that question. I think the idea is to avoid the overwhelming barriers of starting a legal proceeding in the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia, which kind of overwhelms most lawyers, let alone non-lawyers. What about just going down to the provincial court and filing a small claims court claim? I think that's the gist of where you're going. The legislation allows for important cases like that to be transferred up to the Supreme Court. And so, if I were the province, that would be the first thing I would do, would be to say this is a hugely important case, and it properly needs to be dealt with in the Supreme Court. So that might bring the claim to an end, or
so the claim that's involvement goes where? If it goes
procedurally, it gets very complicated, and sued the province and involved in litigation for the province. We take on major cases. There are so many procedural issues, barriers, and obstacles that it can tie you up for years / decades.
But a law student find it informative to start the process, knowing that it may not end the way you would like.
As a summer internship.
Correct.
No doubt they would find it interesting / entertaining. Here hasn't been used enough in this discussion so far. What we're primarily talking about for food security, right to food, in the Canadian context, is about poverty. So let's be really clear about that. And so starting would have to be informed by and guided by low-income people, and that provides that is kind of overwhelming.
And isn't that what you like sort of tried to make the case at one point years ago? You had used our food costumes.
Yeah, Patty's referring to a case that I was involved with also Claire McNeil, who's here tonight, lawyer at Dalhousie Legal Aid, where we the utility or the Public Utility Act that said everyone has to pay the same rate for electricity, regardless of the impacted low-income people. And to show how food insecurity is imposed on low-income people, Patty's work was brought in, and that was fought for years, and finally made its way to the Court of Appeal, and all kinds of hurtful stuff was said by the Court of Appeal in that case that we're still trying to dig out from. Yeah, kind of saying there are recognized grounds for discrimination, like race, like sex, and other issues, but poverty, that's not the basis for discrimination. People aren't discriminated against on the basis of poverty, which to anyone living in poverty is extraordinarily breathtakingly offensive. Not to mention, people who work in this area. That's unbelievable. Fortunately, I don't think it's so.
Thank you, Vince. Next question. A colleague from Dow.
Thank you, Sylvain, and the panel for sharing your. My question comes from a different angle, more around cultural mindsets and looking at food security. I had the opportunity to through Sylvain to meet Dr. Martin Gooch, who's put out some important research saying that 50% of all food that's produced in Canada goes to the landfill. And I'm just wondering, is there a way to maybe change mindset and build awareness around repurposing and food rescue and bringing it to help around food security? Has Nova Scotia thought about that? I mean, I was astounded when I heard that data.
Yeah.
When it's rescued, I guess.
Yeah, I can just speak to the. What comes to mind for me is that we have a little bit of that system that already exists, and yes, but we have food banks that, like you used 35 years ago, that these covenants were signed, and 35-year food that our corporations, like our large, companies, food industries, dump it's donated food, but it's food that's close to expiry. It's food that, for the most part, food banks in Nova Scotia and Food Banks Canada, I think, are trying to do a better job of providing more nutritious food over the years. That's what I've seen, like more fruits and vegetables and that sort of thing. But, it's a two-tiered food system, so I'm not sure, in terms of food waste and how we, I think there is a role for that, definitely, in terms of just we need to change the whole culture around what is considered to be
that's a
good
question,
food.
a very, very pointed question to the panel. Should food banks exist? I've been asked that question myself, several times by people in Parliament, actually.
Yeah, we know that they shouldn't. They cover up the problem. They're inadequate. They're grossly inadequate in terms of, providing only a few days, usually groceries for somebody. So they do, just a drop in the bucket in terms of addressing the food deficit that families are facing. And they're totally, dehumanizing, I guess is the word. They're just not acceptable. It's not acceptable that that's the system we have in Canada to deal with food insecurity, and it's our governments. They take our governments off the hook as well because it hides the problem. We give to food banks and then it's done. And
Jamie,
yeah, I would just say one additional point to think about, and building off what you said, Patty, is when we're talking about redistributing food, like waste food that's not used, food bank food. We were thinking about that. Ask yourself one question: what is the right to food coming in? What Patty's referring to and others refer to is the charitable model. How can we be more charitable? Should we be more charitable? How should we do it? What does to do with the right? It only exists because there is not full protection of the right. All right. So I don't think we should be focusing on how better to improve charity. We should focus on the problem where in two, ensure that the poor are not given enough food to eat nutrition. Period, full stop.
And I would say not just government, but we as a society, that's what, that we're the people that vote. And then we have limited choice in terms of what we,
Yes.
but it's only, government's only going to change if grassroots, if people actually, want it to change and speak up. And, so that's where, I think like Graham Steele's book, he kind of says you can't just call and complain about the potholes. I think you need to call and make this case
Make this
to
a
where,
point or a priority.
yeah.
Let me, sorry,
I think there's been, my experience is a real hesitance in the food advocacy community to link something like, redirecting food waste as a solution to or a response to food insecurity, which I think is the discussion here. And I think, the point about the basic income, right, is to think about food insecurity as a basic question of economic security, and thereby all the flows from that, which is the provision of choices and so forth. And I think the human rights point could very well be that, we talk in human rights law about something called intersectionality, that this is not just about the right to food, but there are interlinking set of rights that go to, basic needs and obligations of the state that human rights law actually can well accommodate, are intimately related through a kind of human rights lens, because that happens to be the way that we think about rights. We don't just think about them in isolation, we think about how they are having to be connected to one another. So.
while we're waiting for the next question, let me add a couple of things quickly. In my opening comments, I talked about food insecurity getting worse. The reason it's getting worse is because social assistance rates, and I'm over-exaggerating, or I'm simplifying, have been getting worse, taking into account inflation. When was the most adequate year of social assistance adequacy? 1988, to ensure the right to an adequate income. Players have a role here. And I'm looking at you, and this is a generalization. Many of you are students. Many of you will have, when they go to the grocery store, holding one of these reusable food bags from Sobeys. How many of you realize that on the side of that bag, it says nutritional food or adequate food is a human right? Not very many. But Sobeys is saying that you have the right to food security, pointing that obviously they have an interest in. Another but related point, every Tuesday in Nova Scotia, students are given 10% off when they go and buy their groceries.
Did you guys know that? Student? Yeah.
10% off.
You get extra points for that.
And it's great. I support it totally. But if it's good for you, what about the poor? 10% off on Tuesdays? Go. And if not, why not?
Thursday.
Thank you.
Well, social says.
Your food corporation, they find a way to ensure same food.
Question. So you only ask a question during mine. I'll go with someone else.
Obviously, that you have food or going into law. Were citizens able to use that right to hold the government accountable? Like, was there success for doing this?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but for sure in Latin America, for sure in Europe, and I think it's Germany, there is a directly enforceable.
Of enforceability or kind of levels of.
I'll tell you what I know, and again, only what I can say. Not being a deep expert on human rights enforcement, but I mean, certainly some political rights, and then the domestic context around, it's a little bit simpler in the domestic context, are obligated to uphold or respect charter rights. And so it's a bit of a more direct line to be able to, for example, subject municipal violence to charter review, for example, in domestic court. So that's a bit of an easier one. Now I can give you, a good example of where that's been the case. I don't know if we have one in municipal government context, but it's more difficult, particularly because international law happens to be give rise to what we call state actors, nation states, and because municipal governments are kind of sub-state actors, the whole machinery of international human rights law isn't particularly well suited to directly hold municipal governments accountable. Although, as I say, my read, very light read, is that that's changing, and so that the Human Rights Council, for example, is starting to recognize that municipal governments are enmeshed in these kind of networks of governance, and that there needs to be a more direct involvement by UN bodies in supporting municipal governments to as cities, and this has in part to do with some kind of idea about downloading, that we see policy areas increasingly being downloaded to municipalities, and particularly big cities. That part of the consequence of that is that they've kind of risen up to gain more of a focus in some of these areas. The other thing we see is direct networks between cities globally, so in Milan and others to formulate their own networks around governance. And we have something now called the Milan Food Pact, which is really cities getting together and talking about the obligations they have to be involved in food governance. I think that's had a really big impact in some raising awareness on the level of local government's participation. So local governments are a bit of a different kind of animal when we talk about government, so that's why it's a bit of a hard fit. But I do actually think we're seeing some movement. I mean, one way to think about it is, it's pushing the human rights system to adapt a little bit, which is how to think about that, particularly maybe in the food context, to make that a bit more of that.
Other questions? Janet, any questions online? No? Yes.
I had a question for Patty about your work, and you mentioned that you've been doing these food costing surveys, and you've done 7 of them in Nova Scotia, but your last was in 2015. And I'm just wondering, given the importance of advocacy around these issues that you've identified, and the need to continuously subject the government policies around social assistance and setting levels of assistance and so forth, so that they are adequately responding to this right to food that lies within the right to an adequate standard of living. What's the importance of the fact that you've not done it for 5 years? Is there a need? Why isn't it? Just kind of, if you could fill us in on that.
Yeah, it is a huge concern and growing as time ticks away. And but so in Nova Scotia, it was funded between the first one was funded federally, and then the second, all of the subsequent food costing was funded by the province. And so priorities changed, and so there's no commitment to continue, to fund food costing at this point. It's also, there's a trend where I was attended a panel where my colleague Jen Brady presented on the Canada's Food Guide and sort of the new food guide and the implications that has for, it's raised the implications for people living in poverty. Right now, the National Nutritious Food Basket, which is the tool that's used to do food costing, is over a decade old now. That's our new one, and it's a decade old. There's no commitment that I'm aware of to sort of update it based on the new food guide. As well, we now in Ontario.
Sorry, but we tried to now, and with Guelph actually, we did submit a report to Health Canada, costing both guides, the 2007. There was a little bit of a difference, but over time, so in 2019, the difference for a family of 4 roughly was $1.98 a day. The 2007 was actually more. That to reverse by 2022. That the new guide will actually be vegetables, fruits. It's half the plate, and we're highly vulnerable. Right, like in January, we're very vulnerable. So it's going to be a problem. From a food security perspective, it is going to be a problem.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen also trends in Ontario. The Ministry of Health there has always funded food costing to be done as part of the mandatory monitoring in the province, and they've just stopped doing that just within the last couple of years. So it's concerning that, just with that trend and to not have that data, because it's been very powerful in terms of equipping partners to be able to do the advocacy that's helped to keep the issue, I would say, keep it
to
on the
Patty's
table.
point, I do believe, and we've talked with Health Canada several times in the last 12, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but if you are prescribing a certain plate to Canadians, I think that health should consider affordability.
Well, and certainly at the provincial level, it sounds like it hasn't fallen between the cracks. It's more like there was a conscious decision on the part of the government to no longer fund this kind of monitoring, human rights monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to go to the table again with the government to try to make the case that we need this, and we haven't been able to do that yet. But that's kind of on my sort of sort of in the back pocket of something that needs to happen.
I'm just going to pick up on the question and both of your comments. Monitoring. We all know how that's crucially important that go to certain countries that are well-known human rights violators. So, well, yes, of course there need to be violators, or there need to be monitors to investigate and be aware of human rights violations. We're talking about precisely the same thing here. In Canada, in Nova Scotia brackets, the right to food and compliance with that have now been taken importantly away from us. So it makes it more difficult to hold governments accountable when they prevent us from doing this human rights monitoring.
Any other questions? I have a question for the panel. I'll play devil's advocate here. I'm often, something that's one of the cheapest food baskets in the world, 5th or 6th. Why bother about talking about food security at all? I mean, we're a rich country, we're doing okay, the GDP's up, the economy's strong. Why care? Well, how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, some people have access to a cheap food basket, and that's problematic in itself. But other people, if you're a low-income family, you're spending upwards of 50% of your total income on food. So it's not a, that's what, you're spending anywhere, when you do the math, it's probably working out to be, if you were to, again, purchase a basic nutritious food basket. So we have, we have nutrition recommendations of what we need to be a large proportion of our population. So, I would say it's important because if not, like I said, we're going to pay for it in other ways, and we are paying for it already in other ways. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, just to throw another piece of data, dollar stores were sold about $3 billion worth of food to Canadians in 2019. Dollar stores. And you've been to a dollar store? I haven't seen lettuce yet at dollar stores. You can, that metric alone is a bit disturbing.
Yeah,
and when you think about food deserts.
And people are forced to get their food at, Walmart, and it's not, it's
Well, just about the dollar store, if you want to talk about waste, that food that's at the dollar store is, for the amount of packaging, you're probably getting 3 times the packaging, one fourth of the amount of something that's salt and sugar and white flour.
Health is not necessarily a priority at the dollar store.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And if there is anything that
they're becoming more successful at selling food.
It's salt and sugar package.
So, Jamie, Vince, should we care as Canadians? Things are going well or not?
Yeah, I think my first response would be a really simple one. I'd just be to ask what good food means to that person. We talk more and more about that concept of good food, and of course, affordability, as it were, is maybe one dimension of food and food security. But there are, of course, many other dimensions. We talk about culturally appropriate food. We talk about sustainable food. We talk about healthy food, and so. It's certainly no answer for me to try to realize a world in which people have, good food on their plate to simply say that we have a country in which food is relatively cheap. It's not really a real answer. It's really
the comment that Canada is comparatively well off and comparatively cheaper here, and so why should we care? Just when you think about that for a moment, you'll say, what is the key needs to be what is their experience? And the experience, the situation of someone who says, look, you got nothing to complain about. Food's comparatively cheap in Canada is someone who's completely indifferent to the experience of people in poverty.
Thank you very much. One last question, because we're already over time.
My experience issues I'm talking about. I'm just wondering how much of that demographic would be made of people with disabilities. And if it's a lot, would there then be an argument to have those human rights for people with disabilities? But
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have an answer, like an exact proportion, but definitely people on disabilities would be, in terms of the caseload for income assistance. If somebody qualifies for income assistance that's on disability, we've taken a look at it, and it does, the situation is also not good for people on disability. And there's lots of other, there's increased costs associated with care and just living, and so that needs to be taken into consideration. But definitely, I know it's a large part of the income assistance caseload. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, 60% or so of the and
The caseload is people with disabilities and single parents. with
yeah,
children.
it's quite high. I don't know if it's 60% or 70%.
Nobody else qualifies.
Of the caseload. So definitely, it's a population of, it's of concern.
Yeah, we did an analysis of the income assistance caseload in the last year or so, and it's over 70% of income assistance cases are made up of people with disability. That's it. The thing I mentioned on this exact point is that in 1996, the province, when it took over social assistance responsibility, said there are people with certain medical conditions, health conditions, that need increased food for this condition or that condition, heart condition, or any kind of particular health condition, and those are called special diet allowances. People may be familiar with them, and it was a way of accommodating that disability, way of accommodating that kind of thing. So it's over and above the basic food allowance.
How much is it?
Well, it depends on what the condition is. It's food specific. So it would typically range from $30, $40, $50, $60, depending upon the need. It might be boost, it might be some other kind of food supplement, or just a need for an increased protein allowance. There's like 17 different conditions. But here's the thing, that the recognition of that need and the setting of those allowances took place in 1996. I think people in this room can guess how many times since 1996 those allowances have been increased to recognize and take into account the increased cost of food. You know what the answer is?
So they haven't been indexed at all?
At all. Not by a penny. If
So
you go back to
the maternal allowance exception, right?
maternal allowance is, but if you look at the 17 recognized special diet allowances instituted in 1996 and compare the ones from them to the ones today, use an electron microscope, 30%.
And the maximum would be for somebody with celiac disease, gets 150, I believe it is. So
Yeah,
it ranges
150.
from, like, that would be just, because they're usually more expensive to buy.
Basic guaranteed income, advocacy, any other solutions you see on the horizon for this?
I mean, I think just like, advocacy, calling politicians and getting this on the agenda, advocating for, in terms of living wages, basic income, like those are it's an income problem. So I think, and I mean, it's also an exclusion problem, like in terms of our communities. So I think if we're talking about, resilient, vibrant communities, and we're thinking about the climate crisis that we're facing, this is something that we need to start to have these conversations. Like, we just need to talk about these issues, and then try to act in terms of doing whatever we can do as individuals to play a part in terms of trying to affect change.
Okay, solutions you can think of in terms of food security at the municipal level, anything you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think where we're at right now, I think bringing in, all parties, I think we need to try to understand this as a systemic problem. We need to understand the food system as such. I think we have to stop hiding this off into kind of isolated domains, and that's been a problem. It continues to be a problem we keep getting before about. Health Canada not thinking about, different dimensions of food. I think the utility of food for us and thinking about, addressing poverty in particular is that it helps to connect up all of those dots. So I think that's a significant, kind of starting point from perspective. And then I think the advocacy.
That's the one thing that we should think about. We should be thinking about.
I mentioned two.
Sure.
One, provincial budget is being set as we speak. Okay, they're into the final strokes. Write your MLA or write the Minister of Community Services an email, either tonight or tomorrow morning, and say we want dramatically increased social assistance allowance. Number two, while you're at your keyboard, write an email to the CEO of Sylvain and say,
I have his email. Yeah, thank you. We're out of time, unfortunately, but I do want to thank, please join me in thanking our panel, great panel, Patty Williams. I just want to thank Jen Music for sending everything up. So, Jamie, if you don't mind grabbing the gifts. The holidays are not over. We can still give gifts. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And all right.